We're going to speak about the past relationship between Russia and Ukraine. How could we not? And we're going to, a little later on, speak about the future in as much as we can talk about it with any confidence. But I want to start in the present, and maybe, Donnacha, beginning with you. We're now 5 months into this war. That initial phase of the war where Russia tried to take Kyiv, presumably install some sort of a puppet regime, was a failure. It was a colossal failure. And we're now into this new phase of sort of a grinding attritional war focused on the Donbass in the east, where it's being fought over relatively small pieces of territory, certainly in the last week or two. How would you characterize where we are today?
Well, just before I answer that, I'd like just to thank Katrina for inviting me here today, and to you, Ruadhán, for being here, and to Oleksandr in particular for joining us from Kyiv, as his country is currently under relentless attack, and to you here in the audience for your interest in what's going on in Ukraine. I think how we look at Ukraine has transformed fundamentally in the last few months, and I think that's evidenced by your presence here today to discuss what's going on. In terms of where we are now, yes, it's 5 months. Tomorrow will be the fifth month anniversary. We never thought, I think, it would last so long. Certainly that was Putin's plan. It was to end within a couple of days. It was supposed to be a blitzkrieg. Where we are now, there's a campaign of intensive terror being inflicted. It's not just confined to one part of Ukraine. Of course, a lot of the attention has shifted to the Donbass region of Donetsk and Luhansk. But I have friends throughout Ukraine, in Odessa, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, and every day of the week there are attacks in these places. In Vinnytsia recently, 24 people killed. There was a very poignant scene I saw during the week in Kharkiv of a man at a bus stop with his 13-year-old son who had been killed. There are horrific things happening, and it's important not to lose sight of that, because sometimes we get dragged into the geopolitics and Russia, the West, all this, and it's important to remember that this is at its heart a huge human tragedy in the heart of Europe, and there is no obvious end to it. It's unrelenting, it's barbaric, it's intense. The Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs estimates that there's been over 17,000 attacks on civilian targets since February. And about 300 attacks on military targets. So this is overwhelmingly attack on the Ukrainian people, who Vladimir Putin made clear when the war began, he does not recognize there is such a people. Ironically, he also is trying to eliminate what he terms as extreme Ukrainian nationalism for a people that allegedly doesn't exist. There's a lot of paradoxes there. We saw there just in the last 24 hours another example of another big lie. I mean, there was a deal signed to get grain out of Ukraine. As you know, the world's food security depends a lot on grain exports from Ukraine, and a deal was signed in Istanbul, and only this morning Russia has struck missiles at Odessa, at the port in Odessa, which is very central. There was a time in my life I was visiting Odessa every week, and I have many friends there, and the port is right in the heart of the city centre. So if you're attacking the port, you're attacking the heart of the city, and that's within 24 hours of the deal being signed. But that's how it's been from the very beginning. You remember back in January, we were told there would be no invasion. We were mad to think when we saw people mobilized, all those hundreds of thousands of troops mobilized, we'd be mad to think that there was an invasion going to take place. There was the lie about the pretext, that it was all about denazification and demilitarization. We were lied about when they withdrew from Kyiv. It was supposed to be a goodwill gesture, when actually it was a military defeat, and they were being repelled by the Ukrainians. So it's a depressing point. 5 months from now, we'll be at Christmas time. Will we be at an end? There's no obvious exit strategy right now.
Can we say that any side is winning? I read an interview this morning with President Zelensky, and he was saying because of the delivery of these advanced American missile systems, that had sort of shifted momentum in Ukraine's favor. They're now succeeding in firing long-range missiles that hit fuel depots and storage facilities on the Russian side. And he feels Russian fatigue as well is a much bigger factor now. Can we say that the advantage is with one side or the other, do you think?
It's too early to say that. Russia has made relatively minor advances in Donbass in the last month, but there have been significant Ukrainian advances as well towards Kherson, which is under occupation. And the classic playbook of annexation is playing out there. They're introducing the Russian ruble, they're introducing Russian television, they're rounding up people and torturing people. But we can't say with certain. What we can say is that the Ukrainians have been consistent in saying what they need. They believe they can win, and they also believe that it's imperative that they win, because if they win, the war ends. If Russia wins, there's no Ukraine. So for them, this is much more than just a conflict. This is an existential struggle for their survival as a people. And that's one of the reasons why, despite the overwhelming odds, the complete asymmetry of power between Russia and Ukraine, where they're outnumbered 10-1 in terms of artillery, in terms of ammunition, they have not succumbed. Because at the end of the day, whereas Russia is fighting for empire, for territory, people in Ukraine are fighting for their families, their neighborhoods, their futures. And this is what motivates them. This is what gives them the will to go on.
Alex, delighted to see you. I might bring you in at this point, and I will ask you whether your view accords with that of Donnacha on that question of where things stand now. But could I first ask you, given that you're in Kyiv, could you maybe give us a sense of life in Kyiv today, the mood of the people? We hear a lot about the morale of soldiers at the front, and there are mixed reports on that. But what's the mood among ordinary people in Kyiv today?
It's like almost normal, but in fact it isn't, because still there are remnants. When I came to Kyiv, I had to leave the city for a while to bring my family to the safe place. And I came back in late March, I guess, or something like that, and during the whole time of April, that was a ghost city. It was a very strange feeling when you're walking on the streets, meeting almost no one at all, and the shops closed, everything not really operating, it was very difficult, I met a man in the street in April, an old man, and he asked me, do you know where to get a haircut? And it was really very strange feeling. I wouldn't say that I felt depressed. I really felt very strange. And now it seems like life is far more to normal, and it's like a spring, it's something in the human psyche, that it brings us back to normalcy, and I think it's also a sign of resilience in a way, but still, there are structures there. Not all the concrete structures were removed, because the city was being prepared for a street fight, in fact. And we still have this. Even on my street where I live, I have a little place, where from you can shoot if the enemy approaches, Another one was outside now, looking at the window to that direction right now. But now removed, we also see buildings destroyed, there are quite a few, on my route, couple I see every day, So it's not really a normal situation, of course. And I like how a friend of mine has described it recently. I was struggling to translate it as precisely as possible into English, What you feel, it's like kind of background noise, It's like sticky emotional retardation. That's how he described the situation. Everything you talk about, everything you do. And for the nature of my job, I have to focus precisely on things like my colleague has just described of how the war goes, what our perspectives are, what our chances are, etc. We try and keep ourselves abreast every day, But some people who are just normal people, not professionally engaged, everyone feels like this kind of noise, this kind of background noise, I think. That's how it feels.
Alex, Donnacha mentioned that he believes the Ukrainians are convinced that they can win this. You have particular insights given your work with the government, you're based in Kyiv. Is that your view? Do you think they remain convinced that this is winnable?
I'm absolutely sure that one way or another, we should win this war, and we really have no other choice. I would add some qualification to what Donnacha said, because if the war ends wrongly, not to our benefit, but if the enemy wins, it's not only Ukraine that's going to disappear, it's the whole of Europe which will be in shatters, because the threat goes on, and this is a really big plan that he's after. I mean, the Russian political elite is after, it's far more dangerous than just eliminating Ukraine from the map of Europe, I need to always consider that. And that reality also is in a way conducive to us to believe that we are not alone in this fight, and we aren't really alone in this fight. Now we have entered a phase which could best be described as a war of attrition, which means that it is a war of resources, including not the least of all the moral resources, the mental resources, and I think that's our strong side. We really prove to ourselves, and I hope also to the rest of the world, that a democratic society has an advantage. We are much better self-organized, morally far better off than Russians. You know, their morale is really very low. Their elite, their hypocritical elite, is very much motivated to win their seats on the global arena back. You know, but the common folks, the cannon fodder that expires now on the ground, you know, they're really absolutely unmotivated. In the early stages of the war, there was a lot of surrenders among the Russians, you know. Now, just, you know, I can't talk about this point because this information has been ever since not disclosed, you know, but I think it's still going on, and enough we hear about such things happening, you know, and they really, you know, they really don't know what they are doing here, most of them, you know. And I usually quote when I talk to international TVs, you know, like the Arabs, because I'm an Arabist and I speak a lot on the Arab TV channels, you know. I always quote Napoleon, you know, the victory in the war is 80% morale and only 20% the physical power, or something like that. I may be, you know, rephrasing, but that's the essence. And in practical terms, the HIMARS and the new wave of attacks that we have been able to launch really let the Russians culminate. The Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, said that they are now relaunching a major offensive, and we don't see any signs of that. They have really culminated on most important directions, in fact.
Alex, do you detect any concern either within the government or among the public that Western resolve will weaken? In other words, that as energy prices rise in Europe, as the Ukraine war begins to fade from the headlines, that commitment that's been so important to Ukraine so far will
absolutely. This is one of the major concerns. You know, there's a whole literature about that already, and I'm not going to repeat the obvious. Of course, it's difficult, but there are elements. I mean, because we have a lot of partners, similarly a great power, like 50 countries almost support us. But it is important to see the elements of certain leadership among those, you know, and a clear understanding of the threat, you know. And I hope that works. You know, I hope it will continue working.
Let's talk for a moment about how we got here. We mentioned we're 5 months into the war. We know a lot more now about the build-up to the war 5 months ago, well into last year, in fact, arguably back more than a decade. But thinking now about the reasons that Vladimir Putin gave, you mentioned pretexts, Donnacha, the reasons that Vladimir Putin gave in those days of January, February this year. He talked about NATO expansion to the east. He talked about liberating Ukrainians from, you know, drug addicts, neo-Nazi drug addicts in Kyiv. He talked about saving the Russian speakers of eastern Ukraine. But he also, in some of his more, I'd say, unguarded moments, framed this as a sort of a neo-colonial imperial project, you know, where Russia was taking back what was rightfully its own. Maybe I'll ask you, Donnacha, to begin with. Am I right in thinking that we can see now that the most plausible of those explanations was the last one, that this is a sort of an imperial project on Russia's part?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a very old-fashioned imperialism because, you know, there are many forms of imperialism. I mean, you can have neo-imperial kind of economic domination and whatnot, but this is old-fashioned territorial acquisition. And, you know, the natural boundaries for Putin are essentially the boundaries of the Russian Empire, which worryingly for the neighbors include places like Finland, which has, of course, recently joined NATO as a result, Poland, and a host of other countries. They used to be, until relatively recently, under the control of the Kremlin. And all other pretexts were ill-founded. I mean, if you remember, there was denazification, which was just a code word for regime change. I mean, Ukraine has a Jewish president, doesn't have a single far-right MP in its 450-seat parliament. But that was also harking back to the language used in World War II. Remember World War II? I mean, Russia doesn't commemorate 1939 to 45. They commemorate only 1941 to 45. They forget completely 1939 to 41, when there was an alliance between Russia, Stalin's Russia, and Nazi Germany to divide up Europe. And they believe still, it's still more or less believed by many Russians, that the Baltic states voluntarily joined the Soviet Union, that, you know, essentially Poland wasn't invaded by the Soviet Union, and that Katyn was carried out by the Germans. If you look at opinion polls in Russia, they still show that Stalin is held in very high regard. And therefore, this notion of denazification, I mean, like, which happens allegedly in 45, you know, it coincides perfectly with regime change throughout Eastern Europe. And that's why the language was deliberately chosen, even though it had no basis at all for Ukraine. And then you have demilitarization, this notion that there's this NATO expanding. I mean, this was never about NATO expanding eastwards. This was about the countries of the region who have suffered historically from the Kremlin escaping that cycle of abuse and retaking their place in Europe. Countries like Estonia. Look at the fate of Estonia and Ukraine. Ukraine's population is about 40 times the size of Estonia, but Estonians are sleeping in their beds at night, whereas Ukrainians are not, because for various reasons, Estonia managed to join the Euro-Atlantic structures of NATO and the EU, and Ukraine did not. And therefore, Ukraine was attacked in 2014, and again, of course, more intensely now, not because it was looking likely to join NATO, which actually it wasn't, but because it was not a member of a military alliance, that it was actually unprotected, and it was in fact neutral. I mean, like in 2014, all the things that Putin says he was looking for already existed. So that underlines why it was always a colonial design on Ukraine, which, as I said earlier, he doesn't recognize as a right to exist, that there is no separate Ukrainian people.
Alex, does that generally accord with your view? I read an article, Alex, that you wrote about a decade ago about Russian soft power in Ukraine. And you were describing the various levers they use, the media, the intelligentsia, the Orthodox Church. And you were describing the importance. So notwithstanding the fact that Donnacha can tell us that, you know, this is about one of the attractions, as it were, of Ukraine was that it was neutral, that it wasn't in NATO, that it was accessible in a way that somewhere like Estonia wasn't to the Russians. But Ukraine also had a special place. I think there's a line in your article where you say influence in Ukraine was almost an existential point for the Russian elite. Why is that?
Absolutely, because, you know, the narrative that Russia goes by, and I would say their political identity is hugely built on the idea of Russia forever, the eternal state. And in that narrative, Kyiv plays a very important role, because they have invented a mythology that essentially, this is actually where it begins, you know. In fact, you know, historically, even some Ukrainian authors of the old days, you know, were contributors or inventors of this idea back at the times of Khmelnytsky, you know, in the Middle Ages, you know, when Ukraine was squeezed, sandwiched between the Polish Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Tatars on the south, you know, it somehow linked itself, you know, it made a treaty with the Russians, and ever since there was this idea, which took root particularly strongly in the 19th century, of so-called tripartite Russian nation, composed of the Great Russia, the Russia Minor, which is Ukraine, and the White Russia, the Belarus, you know, supposedly stemming from the same root, you know. It gives, in their imperial thinking, you know, the legitimacy is built also on the kind of autochthonization or the depth of history. They're really very much into this idea of eternal Russia, more than 1,000-year-old Russia, where in fact, it is Ukraine that was always there, the Ukrainian people, the various patrimonias, including the Kyiv one, but also Galway on the west, etc., quite a few of them, you know. And the culture was developing on its own, you know, outside of the framework, what then became the Russian Empire later, much later on. You know. Ukraine was part of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, and then subsequently of the Polish Empire, you know. And that's where the Ukrainian culture really took strong, you know, foundations, you know. We had cities with Magdeburg rule. We had democracy back then in those ages, you know, very old times, you know, while Russia still doesn't have any consistent democratic experience up to now, you know. And there are really a lot of conflating ideas, but Russia strongly prefers their own version of history, which is basically a state building or state justifying, empire justifying mythology. And unfortunately, it's so geographically linked to this place and to the idea of this tripartite people. And it is also has been reinforced later on during the Soviet times by the ideology of constructing a new man, you know, a new society, a so-called Soviet nation, you know, Soviet people as it was framed, you know. And their current mythology is a blend, in fact. It blends the Stalinist ideas, as mentioned by Donnacha, you know, with these old imperial ideas, and they just like, well, in a way, I would say they are not only fighting a classical colonial war for resources, which is true, of course, material resources, not the least the human capital, in fact, because they are very much aware of the fact that they're going down demographically. And now they steal children from Ukraine, you know, this is really a very Nazi project, you know, to my mind, to steal children from a neighboring nation based on the belief that you have somehow to replenish your blood and soil, whatever, you know. They're really very much Nazis in their mentality nowadays, you know, they have become. And on top of that, you know, it is a war for symbolic resources. They really want to conquer this place in order to feel somehow symbolically, mythologically complete, you know. And this is really a huge challenge because it's like you're fighting with ghosts, you know, the past. I mean, we are fighting against all these ghosts, you know, for the sake of a modern democratic state, you know, for the sake of absolutely different set of values. A colleague of ours, you know, has been citing, you know, in a book recently published, you know, a very good right before the war, in the run-up, based on the analysis from our institute, in fact, you know, based on the analysis of the previous phase, which began in 2014. And put an epigraph from Thucydides, you know, like, we and our enemies have nothing in common. We fight for different things. This is absolutely true about this. You know? This is a conflict of values and very deep one.
Donnacha, I don't expect you to know the answer to this question, but what do you think is the moment when Putin decides he's going to try to take back Ukraine, as he sees it?
To take back all of Ukraine.
Is it, I mean, in a way you could date it back to 2008 when he starts to test the West. You know, when he invades Georgia, when he doesn't get much of a response, he gets away with it. There's the influence operations, there's the funding of extremist or nationalist groups in Europe, there's the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. He keeps getting away with these things.
That's it, yeah. No, it was incremental. I mean, I don't think there was like a magic moment when he decided. I think that he was testing the boundaries over the years, and as you suggest, was found that there was no resolute response to aggression. I mean, when you think of what happened in 2014, I mean, I was in Georgia in 2008 when things were happening there, and I lived there for several years. I'm very familiar with the situation there. There was nothing as a result of that war. But 2014, with the annexation of Crimea and the stimulation of conflict in Donbass, I mean, it's amazing how, you know, so shortly after that, Nord Stream 2 pipeline was initiated, the one that's now not going to, of course, it'll be forever suspended. But, you know, there was a clear, I think it was a clear signal to the Ukrainians that you are not us, because if this had happened to France or to Germany or to, you know, any EU member state, you know, there would have been a concerted response to this aggression. But for Ukraine, business as usual largely transcended everything. And we are paying the price for that now, that inaction. I mean, there was this Faustian pact made decades ago that there was this cheap Russian gas and it was self-serving for many countries, but it was also presented almost as an altruistic thing, that you would somehow engage with Russia in a business sense. They would become more like us. But what Russia did was that it essentially divided and conquered. We're even seeing this during the week, as the Hungarian foreign minister is in Moscow pleading for more gas for the Hungarians. And I was watching Russian TV during the week, and they were mocking countries in the European Union, which they say, by the way, the Europeans will disappear because they're not replenishing their numbers, and that the best, going back to what Oleksandr was saying about Nazism, they're saying that the best will survive in natural selection and that Europe is destined to disappear. But they were mocking countries like Spain and Greece and Portugal because they're not going to cut back on this 15% that was announced during the week, and saying Europe is divided. And that was what Putin saw in his past experience, that he had kind of bought one half of Europe and intimidated the other half, and he didn't see any resolute response. So we're paying the price now, but the price is being paid by Ukraine. I mean, essentially, there was no such thing as cheap gas. The price is very heavy, and it's in Ukrainian lives. And I completely endorse what Oleksandr was saying earlier, that this is not just about Ukraine, very much so. This is our struggle as well. This is a European conflagration. Ukraine just happens to be the front line. But as I said, they're paying the price for the mistakes that Europe has made in not confronting Russia when the aggression was obvious. This was foreseeable. Even you go back to 2007 Munich speech of Putin when he started outlining his grievances, right up until his speech of the 24th of February again, outlining his historical grievances. He has been building a case all along and waiting for the reaction. But what he did, that sounds all very pessimistic, but the one thing that he underestimated, well, two things really, was he underestimated the will of the Ukrainian people to protect themselves, their families, their country, but he also underestimated Europe. This is Europe's hour in a way, and Europe either kind of survives and comes out of this the better, or we're all going down together, the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And I think that any attempts to kind of separate our destinies in that respect are doomed to failure. I mean, and that's why it's very promising that Ukraine now has EU candidate status, because I think it ends this artificial divide of them and us. I think now we'll never look at Ukrainians in the same way again, and Ukraine in the same way again. They are now us. And of course, I think we won't be looking at Russia in the same way going forward either.
Alex, Donnacha mentioned the remarkable reaction of the Ukrainian people. One of the things the Russians always emphasized in this sort of influence operation you describe in Ukraine is the linguistic, ethnic division, as they see it. In a way, did they believe their own propaganda? It seems remarkable now to think that Putin really believed that Ukrainian soldiers would drop their arms, that Ukrainian citizens would welcome the Russian occupier. But I wonder, did they believe their own propaganda and actually believe that those ethnic, linguistic points were meaningful in that way? Because what we can see now is that they weren't at all, right?
Absolutely. If I was surprised, of course I was shocked like everyone else, because when you read about things, when you think about war, even you know about the plausibility of war, it's one thing. When it's happening right in front of you, when it's happening to you, it's a different story, So I was shocked but not surprised, because I knew that it would happen, for a long time. I was just thinking about how, in which fashion it could happen. And I was surprised, and I would acknowledge that I was wrong in some of my assessments, even the one that I produced for the government at some point in the run-up to the war, because I rationalized the Russian side too far, in fact. Because I wouldn't, my underlying idea, which I failed to carefully reflect, back then upon, was that I always thought, yes, they managed to cheat their own public very well. And this is a well-established fact. But deep inside themselves, they must know that reality is not the way they describe it, But it really feels like it's not the case, The kind of reality they were constructing for the audiences back in Russia, on the TV screens, it is exactly what is there in their heart or their political leadership. I wouldn't single out Putin only, He's just one of the, I would say, the perfect representative of a whole class of people, who is now running Russia, and or a group, rather, I would say, elite group, But it's really, this is the one thing that surprised me, really, to no end, that these guys really believed, and led to the fact that they totally misread the political and social reality of modern Ukraine. should they have based their advances back in the 90s, they might have somehow succeed better, because back in the 90s, I would recall, and since that, even I wrote 10 years ago, a bit more already than 10 years ago, because this publication came up in 2012, the one you're referring to, and the actual text was written a bit earlier, that was a different reality, because it is really a vibrant nation in many ways, which learned to live on its own. It's very self-minded, self-organized kind of social reality. You look at the people who we call volunteers. The people who help each other, help the refugees, help the IDPs. They're self-organized via social networks. It's a whole movement, and it's not a fruit of today. It was already there back in 2014. And elements of that were actually the ones which were born inside the Ukrainian Maidans, inside the Ukrainian protest movements, And Russia totally disregarded. And the only reason all these developments, the social and political ultimately developments, it totally neglected that. They failed mentally, cognitively, failed to understand who are they confronted with. This is really truth, And the strength is not only in the power of resistance, for instance. Yes, we have in the physical, the kinetic power of resistance, which Donnacha has talked about, but only in the depth, in the social depth, which is huge, in fact. It's something which Russia does not possess, but it is very difficult for them to imagine what is it, because they never experienced such things. The Russian elite on their weekly travels to London, where they hide their kids and their money, they somehow fail to see a democratic society in front of them. They make their bargains, their agreements with Germans about the oil, etc. They bribe some politicians, and they think they can manage. And this is some kind of sick societies that they're dealing with, whereby you can buy anything, and get your way, But they fail to see that democracy is something more, than that. And the social value of that, they absolutely can't read. It's something like to expect a crocodile to understand you when you're faced with, or a wolf, because this creature has absolutely different mindset. They're wired differently now. And this is appalling, in fact. But that's what we deal with.
Donnacha, I have to ask you about one of the most compelling figures in all of this is President Zelensky. And when Alex speaks about how the Russians completely misunderstood how in the decades since independence, Ukraine had developed this really strong national identity that wasn't bounded by language or ethnicity or any of that. A really interesting figure in that context is Zelensky himself. And in many ways, there's a new biography translated into English by a Ukrainian journalist, Serhiy Rudenko, of Zelensky. It's a terrific reminder of the sort of transformation in Zelensky over the last few years. But in many ways, the least interesting thing about him is that he was a comedian. His background is fascinating. His rise to power is fascinating. How he positioned himself vis-a-vis the oligarchs and the power structure in Kyiv. How important do you think he has been in this resistance that Alex describes?
He has been important. There's a tendency in political science, which is the kind of area I'm in, to minimize the role of the individual. Historians tend to elevate it. I guess I show my leanings towards the historians here by saying that sometimes people do make a difference and can make a big difference. And you might remember that in the run-up to the escalation on the 24th of February, U.S. intelligence and other intelligence agencies were more or less telling the Ukrainians there will be an invasion. And they offered Zelensky the opportunity to flee with his family from Ukraine. And I think this is the core difference. I think a lot of the people who we were talking about, the oligarchs that go to London, who are, they would have taken up such an offer. I mean, and I think this is what made him a different type of person. And indeed, when you're, I guess, fighting for your country, he's famously said, I need ammunition. I don't need a ride. And more or less that's been his position all along, that what we need are the means. We have the will. We have the people, but we need the means to defend ourselves. We're not looking to attack anybody else. We're looking to defend our neighborhoods, which are under murderous siege, and we're not going anywhere. And I think that stance set the tone, because of course, if he had, I mean, I don't think it was ever really probably going to be an option for him personally, but if he had, it would have been a very different start to the war if he had fled before the Russians came. But by standing, and he's very, of course, this goes back to his time in kind of as an actor and in the media. He's very conscious of social media, so he was very good at the beginning of the war, and indeed since, in using social media. So I remember him famously in the early days of the war, when again there were rumors, oh, has he fled, is he still there? And going around, he wouldn't shave, so of course you could tell from the facial hair that, you know the way sometimes you see a newspaper, someone's showing that it's today's Irish Times, so you know that it's today. So by the growth of his facial hair, you could see that every day was passing, and he was like, I'm here, look, I'm in the center, my Minister of Defense, he's here, Minister of Foreign Affairs, he's here, and he was sending a signal that, to people that we're not leaving, we will not desert the country. So I think that was vital. And I think the way that he's managed to then address himself to audiences internationally, when you think of Putin with the long table, you know what I mean? Like, the very dour expressions. And then you see Zelensky with his own people, with his own ministers, but also then addressing parliaments, of course, including our own. And how always finding some way to resonate with the population of the parliament that he's addressing. So, of course, when he was talking to Ireland, I remember wondering what would be the common point. And, of course, he picked hunger. Because which resonates so much with Ukrainians, of course, who starved in their millions in the 1930s, but with Irish people as well, of course, in the 19th century. But he's done that in every single address. He's tried to find that common link. So, but he himself, and he would be the first to say, is that he is merely representing, the people of Ukraine. He's not in any way special. He's been always that way inclined. I mean, he's always been the one who says he doesn't want, his picture on the wall. Kind of, he wants simply. I think he said it in his inauguration that he didn't. He just simply wanted to do the right thing. And I think he has been exemplary, and I think he has been inspirational, not just in Ukraine, but I think internationally.
And he's got a big return for all of that work. I mean, he's managed to extract things, or.
Just can I just say, by the way, that wasn't. I mean, this is definitely the war making the man, because there have been 5 presidents of Ukraine in the last 20 years, and no one has managed to stay in office. I mean, and Zelensky's popularity was also, in decline over a period since his election. So, and that's the nature of Ukrainian democracy. I mean, like it's as Alexander said, it's a very different system from Russia, which is essentially long periods of authoritarian rule punctuated by brief times of troubles, be they the Poles invading centuries ago, or be they the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, be they the 1990s. But always the default position is the authoritarian model, which is why the 1990s is not seen as a time of hope or renewal or opportunity in Russia. It's seen as a terrible time, and Putin has more or less reasserted this authoritarian model with some kind of neo-Soviet elements to it, which appeals to some people.
It's interesting to go back now and to read about how Poroshenko, his main rival for the presidency in 2019, was accusing him of Zelensky of being the more pro-Russian of the two.
Absolutely, yeah.
Alex, I suppose it's natural, you would expect when a country is invaded that its people will rally around the head of state. But I presume this transformation we're describing here is evident in attitudes towards Zelensky in Ukraine, right?
Yes, absolutely. You see, even what Poroshenko, was saying about Zelensky, it means only that he fell prey to the very Russian narrative that if the person has Russian as his first language, by the way, Poroshenko's first language as well is not Ukrainian but Russian, then this person is somehow, or probably could be, pro-Russian, but that was used, it was really spinned, in fact. This idea. I don't think he strongly believes himself in what he's saying. This is an argument. The discussion, yes, it is around the divide, whether or not, someone is pro-Russian or not. That was the major scenario of the debate over the years in Ukraine, and we were seeing that what we described as pro-Ukrainian parties were winning more ground, even in Donbass, by the way. People, when talk about Donbass, they think it is some pro-Russian area, Russian speakers, etc. And then there comes the Russian narrative, which is uncritically repeated by all the media across the world, including the language-speaking ones. But just take note that when the whole thing erupted in 2014, there had been a huge portion of the middle class, primarily the better off and the thinking people who left Donbass. And they didn't go to Russia. They went to the mainland Ukraine, the Russian speakers, Their quarters in Kyiv populated, the new construction, new development sites, populated by people originally from Donbass. There are whole areas like that, neighborhoods, I mean, in Kyiv right now. There are people who I know who fled, who are double IDPs, who had to flee second time, from Russians, and they come originally from Donbass as their ancestors, third or fourth or whatever generation do, So he is also a person, Zelensky, from an industrial place, Kryvyi Rih, which is not Donbass, of course, but they had plans also and still have, they see these areas where he comes from as their legitimate target, up until now. But this is how the mythology works, The fact is absolutely different. When you raise this usual question about divides, I would suggest that we talk about now in the modern context, we should talk about not the divides, but cultural and ethnic and linguistic diversity. This is something which is a fact of life in Ukraine. Even inside the Ukrainian-speaking communities, there is an element of diversity. People talk different languages, and this is really very impressive. It's interesting. I went this time, like I told you, when the war began, for a short while to Western Ukraine, and I enjoyed talking to the locals. They're very nice folks overall, very friendly and very hospitable, but they talk a very ancient kind of Ukrainian, which is really, really very nice. It's like, in your case, I think you would appreciate it as islanders, like when you go to this place which you call the Irish, how do you call this? Gel. Yeah. 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 That's really impressive. And we also have people, Hungarians, for instance. We have various types of Roma, who some of them are not Roma, they don't call themselves as such, Roma, Hungarian-speaking Romas we have Bulgarians, we have plenty of various folks, from Central and Eastern Europe living in Ukraine. Aside from the language, there are a variety of sorts in various areas. We even have the Greeks who are Turkic-speaking Greeks, in Donbass, and also the Hellenic kind, but ancient type of Greek. But that was all suppressed by Russia. And while we have this ethnic and cultural diversity, this is something totally forbidden and suppressed in Russia up to now, And that, as a cultural project, the colonial project, which they are about to bring inside Ukraine right now, because they are again forbidden the change in in Kherson, they're trying to change the curricula from Ukrainian to Russian. The teachers reject that unanimously or almost, and this is a cultural war. They absolutely different Google's for that thing, but unfortunately their narrative is prevalent by the force of their investment in their media empire, which is also English speaking, and by their bribing, in fact, a whole bunch of journalists all across the world.
10 minutes, okay.
Could I just pick up on just one aspect of that? Because it's very important, the points that Oleksandr raised, and just two things. One are the double IDPs. I just remember distinctly giving lectures just over a decade ago in Donetsk University. And I remember the students and faculty there after 2014 having to become, essentially refugees in their own countries or internally displaced people. And where did they move to? They were moved to Mariupol. So, of course, this year, of course, they were doubly traumatized and have now been pushed further into Ukraine. So this is definitely a huge phenomenon. But the language issue is one of the biggest misconceptions. And the example I often give, Oleksandr, which I'm sure you appreciate since you mentioned the Gaeltacht, is that it would be as erroneous to suggest that because an Irish person speaks English, that they necessarily are pro-English or anti-Irish. It's as ridiculous to say that because somebody in Ukraine speaks Russian, though I have noticed anecdotally from people I know, and indeed Zelensky is a good example of this as a person who can speak both Russian and Ukrainian perfectly, but for a lot of his professional life he was speaking Russian. Indeed, his famous series Servant of the People he was speaking predominantly Russian, but now he speaks only in Ukrainian to the public. And I've noticed that among friends of mine throughout Ukraine who it wouldn't be as good as their Russian, and now they only want to speak in Ukrainian. So in a way, Vladimir Putin has created the very Ukraine that he most feared and said he didn't want to occur, a Ukraine that is anti-Russia, but not it's not Russophobia as it's often called, because phobia is an irrational fear. This is a very rational fear of aggression, and one that's focused on Ukrainianness and the Ukrainian language.
We had an interview in the paper yesterday with the mayor of Dnipro who made the same point very eloquently. He said, I speak Russian, it's my native language, I think in Russian, but I'm Ukrainian and nothing else. And he was making the very same point. So we have 10 minutes left. Does anybody, I might open up to the floor here and see whether anybody has any question. Just here in the middle, yeah.
Donnacha, just that you mentioned earlier.
Oh yeah, it's just one minute. We'll get a mic to you now.
About the how we think about Ukraine now, and how we think about the Ukrainian people. We think of them now as more European, so at least I do. But you also mentioned we will think differently about the Russian people. Can we separate the Russian people from Putin and, as Alex pointed out, the gang? And is there a differential between the two? Thanks.
Do you want to take more?
Maybe take that one.
Okay, so I think I said Russia rather than the Russian people, but it's an important point that you raise anyway about is there a way that we can distinguish between Russia and Russian people? And the problem is that, well, there are two problems. One is that it's difficult in a dictatorship to get accurate barometers of how everybody's thinking. But at the same time, we can make some generalizations and say that, and again, I have Russian friends, I on social media, I follow their postings, and there is a lot of either support or indifference about this war, which is worrying in the extreme. And it's a very painful thing to see, because it's dehumanizing not only about the people that they're referring to and the object of the aggression, but it also dehumanizes, of course, themselves as kind of vehicles of hate. But there's no question that during wars, Putin's popularity has surged historically. I mean, when he came to power in 1999, he immediately went from being Mr. Nobody. He had to write an autobiography after he became president to introduce himself to the Russian people. But he immediately became a popular hero because of the war in Chechnya. And Grozny was the template. I mean, what we see in Mariupol and other places, it first starts in 1999, at the very beginning, the decimation of cities. And that boosted his popularity. And then you see the other wars, including the annexation of Crimea in 2014, was hugely popular. So it's, we don't want to get into a situation where we say, like, because somebody is Russian, that they have to have certain sentiments. As I said, I know many Russian people who do not have those sentiments. But at the same time, we cannot ignore the unfortunate reality that a lot of Russian people support what is being done by their state. And in a way, I think there is an obligation when war is being conducted in your name, that you have some kind of, you have to try and create some distance from that. Especially if you have the liberty. There are Russians who are living outside of Russia who also have the option of declaring their allegiances one way or the other.
Okay. I'll go here and then I'll come back. In the far corner here, yeah.
How are you?
Shall I add something on that or not?
Sorry, Alex.
Yeah, shall I add my version?
Yes, well, by all means, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah. You see, we see actually the whole of the Russian nation responsible in the same fashion as the whole of the German nation was responsible for what happened in Europe during the Second World War. We know the cases of very courageous men and women in Germany, in the old days, the priests and etc., this resistance branch of the Lutheran Church, etc. We also knew that some left-wing elements were also pretty much fighting against the Nazis, We see in Russia only passive resistance nowadays by fleeing the country, That's what their cultural elite has done, There are many entertainers have immigrated to the West or to Israel, the most popular ones with their resonant names, and we read a lot of stuff on the social media, and it's absolutely toxic, They are infatuated with the idea of getting their lost past back, And I don't think that we should divide, because also, of course, in some ways we can talk that we have or we observe, we don't have it, thanks God, but we are confronted with something that could, in a way, be described as a state capture in Russia, because there is a gang of very closely connected former KGB officers who now run the industries, run the country, run the politics, everything. And the military ultimately, as well as under their sway. But they did not come there by a coup, projecting this image on them would be to sort of mirror projecting what they tell about Ukraine, that we have a Nazi government which somehow imposed itself on people against their will. That was their by story, the justification that they used for their aggression. In Russia, it is different. I strongly believe that Putin is legitimate and still is by a so-called phenomenon of negative legitimacy of the dictators. The successful dictators match the expectations. He's a person from the street. There are multiple Russians. There are a huge number of them who would identify themselves with him. He's just like them. They're happy and proud of him. And the kind of messages everyone, because among the cultural elite also, there are very notable figures who support the narrative of war. The director of Hermitage, said that our exhibitions that we bring to the West are also a special operation. This is an almost direct quote, The Russian cultural phenomenon as such, which was an element and strong weapon in their soft power toolkit, we're now reconsidering all that, There is a strong pressure now among the society on the local governments, and there is a movement to change the names of the Russians, of the streets which were named by Russian authors like Pushkin, etc., to Ukrainian ones. We see that, and in fact, it is true that Russian culture is and continues to be used. It has been weaponized in the same fashion as Russia has weaponized the refugees in Syria. In the same way, it has weaponized everything, and it has converted this element of or tool of their soft power into something far more dangerous, in fact. They're using that against, to suppress other identities, and it is, and coupled with their genocidal behavior in places like Bucha in the vicinity of Kyiv. This is really astonishing. This is really something that could not be addressed along these rules of like good people, This is a huge simplification. Russia, in order to be the good and bad to be sorted out inside Russia, it needs to go through a healing process in the same fashion as Germans did. The problem with the communist empire is that, unlike the Nazi empire, it never went through such process of self-purification, but it did. It did in the case of Ukraine, most successfully. It did to a large extent in other post-Soviet countries. It failed to a large extent in places like Belarus. It was very uneven. And it succeeded more than 100%, I would say, in the Baltic states. The empire is being healed, and probably, hopefully, Russia will, but it will take a huge effort, not the least the war effort, the deterrence, all sorts of things to happen, in order for this to happen. Since then, that time, we could talk about who is really responsible for what. And now we certainly know who is responsible for very heinous crimes committed in Ukraine. There is a huge and growing list of these persons, including the simple folks, not only the leaders, the executioners.
Thanks, Alex. What I might do is I'll take this question here and the one here, two in from the right as I look at it.
The answers will have to be short.
Yes, indeed. So,
We're under terrible pressure.
yeah, I'll just take these two and then we'll see how far we can get. Just here first, maybe.
Hello. I'm amazed that after an hour of discussion, we haven't heard the word Minsk Accord mentioned at all, or the 14,000 people that were killed in Donbass and Luhansk between 2014 and the 24th of February. But I'd like to quote from an Irish Times article from the 13th of July, and it's by Professor Geoffrey Roberts in Cork University. And he says, the direct quote, Moscow spent years trying to implement the so-called Minsk Accord, under which rebel Donbass will be reintegrated into Ukraine, providing there was guarantees of regional autonomy. And I'd like to know if you agree with Professor Roberts. Did Moscow try to implement the Minsk Accord or not?
I'll just take the one other question and then we'll take them both together. There's a question here, one in from the right. Thanks.
Putin has threatened Europe and recently, I think it's 2 days ago, with doomsday, nuclear war. And I was just thinking, like, if the war is going badly for Russia, like, losing the war, would Putin be crazy enough to cause nuclear war?
Okay. We'll be as brief as we can. Donnacha, do you want to go first?
Yeah, in terms of the question first of Putin and nuclear war, that's often brought up. I mean, it is only the Kremlin that mentions the fact that it has nuclear weapons. The Americans, for example, in Vietnam or Afghanistan never advertised the fact. And that's because it's a sign of weakness. It's a recognition that they have to use it as a scare tactic. Because ultimately, it's often forgotten, when you look at the size of Russia, the overwhelming size, it's often forgotten that its economy is a little bit bigger than that of Spain, smaller than that of Italy. It's not a global superpower. It's a regional, well-armed bully. And the kind of, we have nukes being advertised periodically is essentially to do that. But if you allow it to be used as a scare tactic, then there's no end to the amount of blackmail you can get into. Because if you're not going to defend Ukraine because Russia has nuclear weapons, why would you defend Poland or Estonia or indeed, France or Italy? So that's that. But it's an important point that you raised because it has been raised periodically. Sorry.
I might just.
Yeah.
Alex, maybe if you come in on the first of those two questions, I hope you heard it. It was about the idea that Russia had made an attempt to resolve the conflict in the Donbass.
No, it didn't.
It wasn't reciprocated.
It didn't. From the onset, Russia used Donbass as a bridgehead in order to penetrate further into Ukraine. That was the project. Why the Minsk Accords were signed? Ukraine, by then, was weak. It was also weakened by the war, which began in 2014. Ukraine managed to defend the line, and to establish the so-called line of control, which splits across, which has now been overtaken, and by Russians in many places. It managed to establish a line of control, and in order to hold on against the further aggression, the former president made a concession, a very huge concession, which was a wrongful one. He's been criticized ever since multiple times. A concession which was hugely unpopular in Ukraine. Also a complicated concession which allows for multiple various interpretations. And Russia always insisted on their own interpretation. Russia was always insisting on that they are peace builders, they are not really the party. The underlying problem with this agreement was that the true other side in the war were Russians, not so-called separatists, because these separatists are a proxy force constructed by Russians, created by Russians, in fact, but they were insistent, and that somehow was swallowed for the sake of peace by so-called Normandy format, which is Germans and French. And that was going on for a number of years up until now, and was designed by Russia, which is clear by now, only for remobilize, regroup, and get prepared for aerial onslaught, which is happening since February 24th. That was clear to many, but not to all. And certainly it was an idea that was they looked the other way, you know, from such thoughts, you know, the Europeans, the European Union members who really tried to diplomatically resolve this whole thing. Russia was never sincere about peace because how could it? It annexed Crimea rapidly. The Ukrainian army was reduced to almost nothing by Yanukovych, because Yanukovych even had planned to cancel the armies as an institution. Do you know about that? That was not publicly known, maybe not even discussed in the media, but this is a fact which I know from the first-hand sources. And having the army faced with this much weak army, you know, Russia, of course, was managing, you know, very well to establish itself on the east. You know, it really tried to go further but failed. Thankfully, it had a plan to establish so-called Novorossiya, which is exactly or almost, except Odessa, which they are handling right now. They had that plan in their minds, you know, and it is quite far from being striving for peace. I'm sorry.
I'm going to get in terrible trouble if I don't wrap this up. I can see people getting quite anxious. I'll tell you, I've learned a whole lot from this. I hope you have taken something from it as well. Thank you for coming along, and please thank our two wonderful guests, Alex and Donnacha.